My name is Caleb Torres, and the morning Gerald humiliated me in front of Mila's entire family was the morning I stopped being the man who apologized for breathing too loud. I was setting breakfast plates on the dining table when Gerald's hand shot out and yanked the ceramic dish from my grip. "You hold that like a scared raccoon," he announced to the room. Mila's aunts exchanged glances. Her cousins stared at their phones. Mila herself froze halfway through pouring coffee, the pot trembling slightly in her hand. Gerald wasn't finished. He circled me like a predator, examining wounded prey, pointing out how I placed the forks wrong, how I stood with bad posture, even how I breathed too heavily through my nose. The room filled with thick silence except for his sneering voice. I swallowed the anger rising in my throat and excused myself to the kitchen. As I walked away, I caught something in my peripheral vision. A small camera mounted on the bookshelf, its lens pointed directly at where I'd been standing. Gerald stood beside it, adjusting the angle with a smirk I'd never forget. The camera discovery haunted me through the rest of that morning. I tried to focus on cleaning dishes, scrubbing plates with more force than necessary while my mind raced. Why would Gerald record that moment? Was he collecting evidence of something? Building ammunition for future attacks? The questions multiplied faster than I could process them. When I returned to the dining room to clear the table, the camera was gone. Not moved. Gone entirely. The shelf sat empty except for a decorative vase that definitely hadn't been there before. I questioned my own memory for a moment, wondering if stress was making me see things that weren't real. But I knew what I'd seen. Gerald wanted me to know he was watching. He wanted me to feel paranoid, off balance, constantly second-guessing myself. The psychological warfare was deliberate and calculated. Mila found me standing there, staring at the empty shelf. "You okay?" she asked softly. I wanted to tell her about the camera, about her father's games, but the words stuck in my throat. How do you tell someone their parent is systematically trying to destroy their marriage? I decided to prove myself through action instead of words. The kitchen cabinet had been loose for weeks, the drawer sliding crooked every time someone opened it. Gerald complained about it constantly, always with a pointed look in my direction. So I gathered tools from the garage and set to work repairing it. The moment I applied pressure to remove the drawer, the entire fixture collapsed, wood splintered, screws scattered across the tile floor. The crash echoed through the house like a gunshot. Gerald materialized in the doorway within seconds, as if he'd been waiting nearby. "See? You break everything you touch." His voice carried that particular satisfaction reserved for people who've been proven right. Mila rushed in behind him, confusion written across her face. I knelt among the wreckage, examining the damage more carefully. The screws showed fresh tool marks around their heads. Someone had deliberately loosened them before I'd even started. I held one up to the light, turning it slowly. The scratches were obvious once you knew to look for them. Gerald's theatrical outrage suddenly made perfect sense. I returned to the garage to put the tools away, my hands still shaking from controlled anger. The workbench sat against the far wall, cluttered with old paint cans and forgotten projects. As I hung the screwdriver on its hook, my elbow knocked against something taped underneath the bench's surface. I crouched down and found an envelope secured with clear packing tape. The word proof was written across it in Gerald's distinctive handwriting. My fingers fumbled with the tape as I pulled the envelope free and opened it. Inside were printed photos, maybe 20 of them, showing me performing various household tasks. But something was wrong with each image. In one, I appeared to be dropping a plate, caught mid-fumble. Another showed me holding a hammer at a dangerous angle. A third captured me, supposedly tracking mud across clean floors. Each photo was carefully framed to make me look incompetent, careless, or destructive, but I recognized the moments. The plate photo was taken as I was setting it down gently. The hammer shot caught me mid-swing during a repair. The mud was from a rainy day when I had taken my shoes off immediately. Someone had documented my life and twisted every moment into evidence against me. That night, I showed the photos to Mila. We sat on our bed with the door locked, spreading the images across the comforter like puzzle pieces. Her face cycled through disbelief, recognition, and finally sadness. "He's done this before," she whispered. Her voice carried the weight of old wounds reopening. She told me about previous relationships her father had destroyed. 2 boyfriends in college who mysteriously left after spending time at the family home. 1 fiancé who broke off their engagement after a weekend visit, citing concerns about Mila's family dynamics he couldn't articulate. Gerald had a pattern of sabotaging anyone who got too close to his daughter. But then Mila revealed something darker. Years ago, before she was born, her mother had been in a relationship Gerald couldn't control. He'd used similar tactics, manufacturing evidence and manipulating perceptions until the man fled. Her mother had confided this story to Mila during a rare moment of honesty before she disappeared from their lives entirely. Was he planning to push me out from the start? I asked. Mila's silence was answer enough. Sleep became impossible after that conversation. I lay awake listening to the house settle, every creak and groan carrying new significance. Around 2 a.m, I heard deliberate footsteps in the hallway outside our bedroom. Slow, measured steps that stopped directly outside our door. I waited, barely breathing, until the footsteps retreated back down the hall. When I was certain Gerald had returned to his room, I slipped out of bed and opened our door as quietly as possible. The hallway table held something new that definitely hadn't been there earlier. A small black object, roughly the size of a deck of cards, sat angled toward our bedroom door. I picked it up carefully and recognized it immediately. Another camera, still warm from Gerald's hands. The lens was positioned to capture anyone entering or exiting our room. I stood there holding the device, feeling violation and rage mix into something cold and calculating. Gerald wasn't just documenting my failures. He was surveilling our entire lives, waiting for a perfect moment to strike. What exactly was he trying to capture? The next morning, while Gerald was out running errands and Mila was at work, I followed the camera's wiring. It led down through the walls, snaking along the baseboards until it disappeared through a vent near the basement stairs. I'd never been in Gerald's basement workspace. He kept it locked, claimed it was his private sanctuary. But today the door stood slightly ajar, as if inviting investigation. I descended the wooden steps carefully, each one groaning under my weight. The basement was dimly lit, smelling of old concrete and electrical equipment. In the corner sat a desk with 3 monitors arranged in a semicircle. Each screen showed a different room in the house. The kitchen, the living room, the hallway outside our bedroom. Cables ran everywhere, feeding into a central hub that recorded everything. My stomach turned as I realized how thoroughly Gerald had been watching us. But something else caught my attention. A metal safe sat beside the monitors, roughly 2 feet tall, and it was humming, not loudly but distinctly. A subtle vibration ran through the metal casing. I pressed my ear against it and heard electronic components running inside. What was Gerald hiding that required constant power? I texted Mila a photo of the setup. Her response came back immediately. That safe didn't use the buzz. Dad guards it like his life depends on it. I circled the safe slowly, examining it from every angle. The lock was electronic, requiring a 6-digit code. The humming suggested a hard drive or server running inside, something generating heat that needed ventilation. Small slots in the top allowed air to circulate. Gerald had positioned it where he could monitor it constantly from his desk chair. I tried random number combinations, knowing it was pointless but unable to stop myself. Each failed attempt made the safe beep disapprovingly. After the 5th try, I heard the basement door open upstairs. Gerald's footsteps crossed the floor above me. I barely made it back upstairs before he descended, his face suspicious. "What were you doing down there?" he demanded. I held up a light bulb I grabbed as cover, replacing this in the hallway fixture. His eyes narrowed, but he couldn't prove otherwise. That night, the buzzing haunted my thoughts. What required that much power and secrecy? The next afternoon, I was taking out trash when Mrs. Lowe from 3 houses down stopped me on the sidewalk. She was elderly, maybe 70, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You're Mila's husband," she stated rather than asked. I nodded, and she stepped closer, glancing toward Gerald's house. "Don't let him twist your mind like he did to her mother's," she said urgently. Her expression held genuine concern mixed with fear. I froze. What do you mean? But her face suddenly changed, eyes widening as if she'd realized she'd said too much. Forget I mentioned it, she stammered, backing away. Just be careful. She hurried back to her house before I could press for details. I stood there holding the trash bag, processing her warning. Everyone in this neighborhood seemed to know something about Gerald's history. Something about what happened to Mila's mother. The woman had supposedly abandoned the family years ago, unable to handle Gerald's intensity. That was the official story, at least. But Mrs. Lowell's fear suggested the truth was darker. What had Gerald done to Mila's mother? 2 days later, Gerald took an afternoon nap, something he did religiously after lunch. I saw my opportunity and took it. The basement door was locked this time, but I'd made a copy of the key from an earlier visit. My hands shook as I descended those stairs again, knowing I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. The monitors still displayed their feeds. I sat in Gerald's chair and navigated through the recording software, searching for recent files involving me. They were gone. Every single one wiped completely from the system. Folders that should have contained weeks of footage sat empty. But one folder remained, standing out like a beacon. Final proof was labeled across it in capital letters. I clicked it, and a password prompt appeared. 6 asterisks blinked at me mockingly. I tried Mila's birthday, Gerald's birthday, random combinations. Nothing worked. The folder remained locked, containing whatever evidence Gerald considered definitive. After 10 failed attempts, I gave up and cleared my browsing history. Whatever Gerald planned to prove, he was building towards something big. The question was whether I could stop it before he executed his plan. The explosion came during Friday dinner. We'd gathered around a table, just the 3 of us, when Gerald suddenly gasped and pointed at the corner shelf. "The vase!" he shouted. "My mother's antique vase. It's broken." We all turned to look. Sure enough, the decorative vase lay in pieces on the floor, porcelain shards scattered across the hardwood. I stared at it confused. The vase had been intact when I'd walked past that spot 30 minutes earlier. Gerald rounded on me immediately. "You knocked it over, didn't you? When you were stumbling around earlier." I opened my mouth to deny it, but he was already pulling out his phone. "I have proof," he declared triumphantly, showing us a photo. The image showed me reaching near the shelf, my hand close to the vase. But I recognized that moment. I'd been dusting the frame beside it 2 days ago. The photo was from the envelope of staged evidence. "That's from Wednesday," I said calmly, and I was dusting, not knocking things over. Gerald's face flushed red. "You're calling me a liar?" I held his gaze. "I'm saying that photo doesn't show what you claim it shows." For the first time, Mila spoke up. "Dad, if he says he didn't break it, I believe him." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Gerald's fist slammed down on the table hard enough to make the silverware jump. He stormed away without another word, leaving Mila and me in stunned silence. She'd never publicly contradicted her father before. The consequences terrified me, but I also felt something like hope. The next morning, Mila's younger cousin Leo appeared at our door. He was 19, studying computer science at the local college, and he looked nervous. "Can we talk privately?" he asked, glancing back toward Gerald's room. We stepped outside into the backyard. Leo pulled a small USB drive from his pocket and pressed it into my palm. "I've seen Uncle Gerald plant evidence before," he admitted quietly. "He did it to my mom when she questioned his control over the family. I started documenting things, just in case." He explained that he'd been secretly recording Gerald's behavior during family visits, suspicious that his uncle's reputation for destroying relationships wasn't coincidental. "What's on this?" I asked, holding up the drive. Leo's expression darkened. Something Gerald would never want exposed. Proof that his version of family history is a lie. That afternoon, while Gerald was out, I plugged the USB into my laptop. The drive contained a single video file dated from 8 years earlier, before Mila and I had even met. I pressed play and felt my blood run cold. The footage showed Gerald in the same house, standing in the kitchen and screaming at a woman I recognized from photos as Mila's mother. His face was twisted with rage as he accused her of plotting against him. of turning the family against him, of planning to leave and take Mila away. But what struck me most was young Mila visible in the background, maybe 13 years old, watching her father's breakdown with absolute terror in her eyes. She stood frozen in the doorway, clutching a stuffed animal to her chest. The video continued for 6 agonizing minutes. Gerald's accusations became increasingly paranoid and disconnected from reality. Mila's mother tried to calm him, but every word she spoke only fueled his rage. Finally, she gathered young Mila and left the room, and the video ended. This directly contradicted Gerald's story that Mila's mother had abandoned them. She hadn't abandoned anyone. She'd fled. Why would Gerald hide this footage for years? I showed the video to Mila that evening. We watched it together on my laptop, and I watched her face crumble as she witnessed the truth about her childhood. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she recognized the moment her world had fallen apart. "He told me she left because she didn't love us," Mila whispered. "He said she chose freedom over family." The video proved otherwise, but Mila had more to reveal. She'd been searching through old boxes in the attic and found her mother's journals, hidden in a trunk beneath winter clothes. The journals described years of escalating behavior from Gerald. He'd sabotaged home repairs and blamed his wife. He'd broken items and accused her of carelessness. He'd installed cameras and monitored her movements. He'd manipulated visitors by staging scenes that made her appear unstable. The pattern was identical to what he was doing to me now. He forced her out emotionally, Mila said, her voice hollow. He made living here so unbearable that leaving seemed like the only option. The realization settled between us like lead. Gerald wasn't just repeating tactics. He was running the exact same playbook he perfected on Mila's mother. Was he planning to do the same to us? The journals contained one more crucial detail. Mila's mother had written the safe's password in code, hidden within a recipe for apple pie. She documented it as insurance, knowing Gerald might try to erase evidence of his behavior. Mila and I worked together to decode it, replacing ingredients with numbers according to a pattern her mother had explained in an earlier entry. We arrived at 6 digits that might unlock everything. The next morning, Gerald left for his weekly poker game. The moment his car disappeared down the street, we descended to the basement. My hands trembled as I entered the code into the safe's keypad. The lock beeped once, twice, then released with a satisfying click. Inside sat an external hard drive, still humming with power. Beneath it were stacks of printed reports, dozens of pages documenting alleged incidents involving Mila's mother. Accusations of theft, emotional instability, poor parenting, infidelity. All lies, according to the journals. But at the bottom of the safe sat a document that made my blood freeze. The title read, "Emergency Plan, Mila's Husband." I pulled it out and began reading Gerald's blueprint for destroying our marriage. The plan was detailed and methodical. Gerald had documented exactly how he would use staged evidence to portray me as dangerous to Mila's well-being. The cameras would capture selective clips showing me in compromising positions. The sabotage repairs would demonstrate my incompetence. The manufactured incidents would build a narrative of escalating instability. He'd planned to present this evidence to Mila during a family intervention, with aunts and cousins present as witnesses. The pressure would be overwhelming, the evidence seemingly irrefutable. Gerald had calculated that Mila would have no choice but to leave me for her own good. The document even included talking points, rehearsed lines designed to maximize emotional impact. "I only want what's best for you. A real man wouldn't make you defend him. Your mother would want you safe." Every manipulation was planned with surgical precision. But reading Gerald's playbook gave me something unexpected. Understanding. I knew his moves before he made them. I could see the game board completely, and that meant I could turn his plan against him. I photographed every page, backed up the hard drive contents, and carefully returned everything to the safe. Then Mila and I began planning our own surprise. I installed a single camera in the upstairs hallway, small enough to blend into the smoke detector housing. Unlike Gerald's surveillance network, mine had one specific purpose: documenting his nightly activities. The first night of recording captured exactly what I expected. At 2:30 in the morning, Gerald emerged from his room and began his routine. He moved through the house with practiced stealth, adjusting items to appear out of place, repositioning objects to later blame me for moving them. The camera caught everything in clear detail. His face when he thought no one was watching. The calculated way he created chaos. The satisfaction in his expression as he manufactured evidence. I watched the footage the next morning and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity. Gerald had operated in shadows for years, confident no one would expose him. But light was about to flood every dark corner. I saved the footage to 3 separate locations, uploaded copies to secure cloud storage, and sent encrypted backups to Leo. This was just the first piece of documentation I'd need. The reversal had begun, and Gerald had no idea the trap was closing around him. Over the next week, I became deliberate in my movements. I rearranged the living room furniture, making sure everything was documented with photos showing the new layout. Gerald couldn't resist. That very night, my hallway camera captured him sneaking downstairs after midnight. He moved decorations to bizarre locations, shifted furniture at odd angles, even knocked over plant and left dirt scattered across the floor. Every action was calculated to make me look careless or destructive, but every action was also recorded. I documented the room's condition before bed and after Gerald's nighttime visit. The contrast was undeniable. In the morning, Gerald discovered the chaos and immediately blamed me. "You must have been moving things around drunk last night," he accused. I pulled out my phone and showed him the before photos, time-stamped and geotagged. Actually, everything was perfect when I went to bed at 11. His face went through several expressions before settling on forced confusion. Well, someone moved things. The footage I had captured was already uploading to a private channel Leo had created. The evidence was building faster than Gerald could react. Where was all this heading? Gerald's confidence was building towards something. I could feel it in the way he watched me, like a predator certain of its kill. Finally, he announced a family meeting for Sunday morning. Mila's aunts were invited, her cousins, even Mrs. Lowe from down the street. He claimed he had conclusive proof that I was ruining the household, making life unbearable for Mila, and needed to be confronted. The morning arrived cold and tense. Everyone gathered in the living room, confusion on their faces about why they'd been summoned. Gerald stood at the front of the room, like a prosecutor preparing his case. I sat calmly on the couch, Mila beside me holding my hand. "Thank you all for coming," Gerald began. "I've called you here because I can no longer stay silent about Caleb's behavior." He described incidents of destruction, carelessness, and emotional instability. He painted a picture of a man spiraling out of control, endangering his daughter's happiness. Then he pulled out his laptop. "I have video evidence proving everything I've said." But Gerald didn't know I'd accessed his final proof folder 2 days earlier. Leo had helped me crack the password using social engineering techniques. We'd copied every file Gerald had compiled, and we'd prepared something he never saw coming. Gerald pressed play on his laptop, confident the footage would devastate me. The screen showed clips of me fumbling repairs, apparently breaking items, looking frustrated and angry in isolated moments. He'd edited everything to remove context, creating a highlight reel of manufactured failure. But I waited calmly until he finished. Then I stood up and pulled out my own laptop. "Those clips are interesting," I said, "but they're missing some context." I played the raw footage from Gerald's own camera feeds, retrieved from his basement server. The unedited version showed Gerald loosening screws before I attempted repairs. They showed him staging breakages and then filming my confused reaction. They showed him rehearsing angry expressions in his bathroom mirror, practicing the outrage he'd display later. The room went completely silent. Gerald's face cycled from confusion to recognition to panic. "Those files were edited," he sputtered. "Someone manipulated them to make me look bad." I shook my head. "These are from your own system, Gerald. Time-stamped and verified." Mila's aunt covered her mouth in shock. Her cousins exchanged horrified glances. Mrs. Lowell nodded slowly, as if pieces were finally falling into place. But I wasn't finished. I had one more surprise that would change everything. I played the hallway footage from my hidden camera. The screen showed Gerald's nighttime activities in perfect clarity, moving through the house and staging scenes to frame me. His face was visible in every shot, leaving no room for doubt. The timestamp in the corner proved these weren't old recordings. The entire family watched Gerald manufacture evidence, planting items and positioning objects to later blame me. They saw him knock over the plant, scatter the dirt, and then carefully step around on his way back upstairs. Mila began crying quietly beside me, finally understanding the full extent of her father's deception. Her cousin Leo spoke up from the back of the room. Uncle Gerald did the same thing to my mom years ago. I've been documenting it ever since. Mrs. Lowell added her voice. He did it to Mila's mother, too. We all knew something was wrong, but we were too afraid to say anything. The room turned to stare at Gerald, who stood frozen at the front. His carefully constructed narrative had collapsed in minutes. No amount of manipulation could explain away video evidence. Finally, Gerald's shoulders slumped. Without a word, he walked past everyone and retreated his room. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like surrender. The family sat in stunned silence for several minutes after Gerald disappeared. Then questions erupted. How long had this been going on? Why hadn't anyone spoken up sooner? What would happen now? I raised my hand for quiet and pulled out a hard drive. This contains copies of everything. I explained. Gerald's surveillance footage, his manufactured evidence, his written plans. Everything is backed up in multiple locations. I handed the drive to Mila's Aunt Patricia, the family matriarch. Nothing can be erased again. The pattern stops here. But I wasn't motivated by revenge. The anger had burned away, leaving only clarity about what needed to happen next. Gerald needs help, I continued. Real professional help. Not judgment, not punishment, but treatment for whatever drove him to this behavior. Mila squeezed my hand, understanding what I was building toward. I'd spent weeks planning not just the exposure, but the aftermath. The goal wasn't to destroy Gerald, but to break the cycle that had damaged multiple generations. I have one more thing to show, I said, feeling everyone's attention focused back on me. But this surprise is different. This one's about healing instead of hurt. The power dynamic had shifted completely. For the first time in his life, Gerald had lost control. Now came the hard part. I stood and addressed the rule with a proposal I'd been crafting for weeks. Mila and I are moving out, I announced. The statement landed with mixed reactions. Surprise from some, relief from others. Not in anger, I clarified, but for peace. This house needs space to heal, and so do we. I explained that we'd already found an apartment across town, a place where we could build our life without the weight of surveillance and manipulation pressing down on us. The move would happen within 2 weeks. But the proposal had a second part. Gerald needs professional help, I said firmly. Not suggestions or recommendations, but actual commitment to treatment. Individual therapy minimum twice per week. Family counseling when appropriate. And full transparency about his progress. I pulled out papers I'd already prepared, agreements outlining expectations and boundaries. If Gerald wanted to remain part of Mila's life, these were the conditions. The room waited for Gerald's response, but his door remained closed. How would he react to being confronted with compassion instead of rage? Would he accept help or retreat further into denial? Mila stood beside me, adding her voice to the proposal. Dad, you lost Mom because of this behavior. I won't let you lose me too, but I also won't live under surveillance and manipulation anymore. The choice is yours. We waited in that tense silence for almost 10 minutes. Then Gerald's door opened slowly. He emerged looking smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched and face aged with exhaustion. He'd been crying. The signs were obvious in his red eyes and tear-stained cheeks. I lost your mother because I couldn't control my insecurities, he said quietly, speaking directly to Mila. I was terrified of losing you too. Everything I did was twisted attempts at protection. His voice cracked on the last word. He sat down heavily in his chair, and for the first time, I saw him as something other than an antagonist. He was a broken man repeating patterns he didn't understand, damaging everyone he claimed to love. I thought if I could prove you'd chosen wrong, you'd stay, he continued. If I could show that he wasn't good enough, you'd realize you needed me. The logic was warped but painfully human. Gerald had confused control with care, surveillance with protection, and now he faced the consequences of those delusions. Will you accept help? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Gerald looked at me with something resembling respect for the first time. You could have destroyed me today, humiliated me publicly. Instead, you offered help. Why? I considered the question. Because hurting you doesn't heal anything. Breaking the cycle does. I pulled out my phone and showed Gerald a photo that made his eyes widen. While you were planning to expose me, I was working on something else. I explained. The photo showed a room I'd been secretly renovating for 3 weeks. Gerald's locked room on the second floor, the one he'd sealed shut years ago after Mila's mother left. The room where she used to paint. I'd spent evenings and weekends carefully restoring it to how it looked before the household fell apart. The easel stood in the corner, positioned to catch afternoon light. Shelves held organized art supplies, brushes and jars, tubes of paint arranged by color. Canvases waited blank and ready. I'd even found some of her old paintings in storage and had them cleaned and reframed. I thought maybe you needed to remember. I said, not who you became, but who you were before the fear took over. Gerald stood without a word and walked upstairs. We followed slowly, giving him space. He stopped outside the closed door, his hand resting on the knob. Then he opened it and stepped inside. The room glowed with late afternoon light. Streaming through windows, I cleaned until they sparkled. Something changed in Gerald's expression. Not a complete transformation, but a crack in the armor he'd built. For the first time in years, he was standing in the space that represented what he'd lost, what he'd destroyed through his need for control. Gerald stood in that room for a long time, touching the easel, running his fingers over paint tubes, examining the restored canvases. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Thank you. 2 words that carried the weight of years. The following weeks brought changes none of us could have predicted. Gerald started therapy with a counselor specializing in control issues and family trauma. The sessions were hard, forcing him to confront behaviors he justified for decades. But he attended every one. Mila and I moved into our new apartment, establishing boundaries that made our relationship feel clean and separate for the first time. Gerald visited by invitation only, respecting limits that once would have enraged him. The painting room became Gerald's refuge. He started spending hours there, not painting himself, but simply sitting with memories and regrets. Eventually, he began reaching out to Mila without manipulation, calling just to talk, asking about her life without ulterior motives. The surveillance equipment was dismantled, the cameras removed, the files deleted under supervision. The basement workspace transformed into storage for ordinary household items. My surprise to Gerald hadn't been revenge by destruction. It had been revenge by transformation, forcing him to face what he'd become and offering a path back to who he'd been. The cycle that had damaged Mila's mother, attempted to damage me, and poisoned family relationships for years finally ended. Even Gerald admitted it in one of our later conversations. You did what I never expected, he said. You helped heal this family instead of destroying it. Looking back, that was exactly the point. Sometimes the most powerful surprise isn't what you take away from someone. It's what you give them that they never knew they needed. The chance to change, the courage to face hard truths, and the hope that redemption remains possible, even for those who've hurt us most. My name is Caleb Torres. Gerald humiliated me in front of his family that morning at breakfast. But by the time I left his house, I'd given him something he'd never expected. Not revenge, not punishment, but the one thing he'd never given anyone else. A second chance. And somehow, that changed everything.